On this week's podcast, the first of the new year, we have two writers with long and storied careers talking about three very different subjects. First up, Bob Gottlieb joins us to talk about his latest book, a biography of Greta Garbo, and about Sinclair Lewis, whose novel Babbitt is 100 years old this year. Then, Carl Bernstein joins us to talk about his memoir, Chasing History, A Kid in the Newsroom. Liz Harris will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us to talk about the books they've been reading and reviewing. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's January 14th. I'm Pamela Paul. Bob Gottlieb joins us now from New York to talk about two different subjects. First, his latest book, Garbo, a biography of Greta Garbo, and then Sinclair Lewis, the subject of an essay he recently wrote for us in the book review. Bob, thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here.
We're going to start with Garbo. And let's go all the way back to when you first encountered Garbo on the big screen. Do you remember that moment?
Well, there wasn't a moment, because remember that since I'm ancient, growing up in the 30s and 40s, Garbo was part of the context of the time. My parents were not particularly movie people. They were theater people more. However, Garbo was in the air. She was known. She was famous. She was one of the most celebrated people of her time, and also one of the most talked about phenomena. So if you were alive and conscious in the 30s and early 40s, Garbo was there in your life, even though you had never seen her on the screen.
In your first chapter, which is called Why Garbo, you note that she had this enormous presence, and yet she only worked in Hollywood for 16 years, and she only made 24 films. I realize that's one of the major questions of your book, but how is it that she had such a tremendous impact and an omnipresence in the culture?
Well, that is the question that led me to write the book. I understood the power of the impact, but I didn't really understand, because I hadn't been seeing her movies, I was too young. I didn't really understand what she was on the screen and how she got to the screen in the first place. So, as usual, it was curiosity that led me to write about her.
And did you come up with an answer?
Well, there's no one answer, but the reality is that no one had ever seemed like her before, and no one has ever seemed like her since. So to trace what those qualities were became the subject of the book.
She is described in the book as, in various places, dull, boring, unsophisticated, unintelligent, uneducated. And yet, despite all of that, again, this huge impact. As a culture, do we just ascribe to her a depth and a meaning that wasn't necessarily there? Or what explains that?
Well, part of it is simply the way she appeared on the screen. Her face, the perfect face, the allure of her eyes, of her skin, everything about her made her a perfect subject for the camera lens. And when her eyes met the lens of the camera, something happened that hadn't happened really before on the screen. That, remember, to begin with, when she got to America, she was still too young to sign her own contract. Her mother in Stockholm had to sign it for her. She didn't know English. She was overweight. People weren't totally sure about her teeth. Her hair was frizzy. As I say, she didn't speak English. And yet, like in 10 minutes, she was the most famous woman in the world. How did that happen? MGM, when they identified her at all, they signed her because Louis B. Mayer fell in love with what he saw her potential was when they met in Berlin in 1924, I guess it was. But they didn't know what to do with her. And immediately she became typed as a vamp, seducing men and leading them on to disaster. She hated it. She didn't think of herself as a vamp. First of all, she knew who she was, which was a uneducated peasant girl from Sweden who lucked in through catching the attention of a very famous director, Moritz Stiller, who featured her in the biggest movie ever made in Sweden up to that time, The Saga of Gösta Berling. He then took her to Berlin, for the opening of the film there. She was taken on by the new but wonderful director Pabst to make her one German film, Joy Street. And then they met Louis B. Mayer in Berlin. And the next thing she knew, she was there in Hollywood, not understanding Hollywood, America, English, really not understanding filmmaking. And it happened overnight. She was there. She made her first movie. She made her second movie, in both of which she was vampy, having started out as naive. And in her third movie, Flesh and the Devil, she was teamed with Hollywood's biggest male star, John Gilbert, and they played erotic scenes far stronger than anything that had ever been seen on the commercial screen. That's probably what propelled her into her extraordinary international fame, which she never lost.
So she starts off as a vamp. That doesn't work out.
No, it does work out. She played the vamp, hating it, and then slowly, as she got more famous with more power at MGM, she was able to move into other things and show other sides of her. She was thought of as the vamp, the heavy, the mysterious, the sphinx, all of those things. But when you see her in some of those early movies, there are parts of them in which she's charming, young, amusing, romping around. Garbo romps. She had many sides to her, but what was focused on, of course, was the mystery, the beauty as it appeared.
What was the transition like for her from silent films to talkies?
Well, it was a very big deal. She was the last major silent star to try sound. Her final silent movie, The Kiss, was the last MGM silent film. It was a big hit, by the way. Only Charles Chaplin, who had his own studio, stayed silent really into the 30s. But MGM and Garbo were too canny just to plunge in. There were a lot of problems with sound at the beginning. They didn't really know how to work with it. And so they waited and waited. And then finally the moment came. She was terrified. They found her an amazing vehicle, which was Eugene O'Neill's Anna Christie. And she took the plunge. And from the moment her voice was heard, it was perfect for the sound films. And it matched her look and what people thought of her. It was deep. It was throaty. It was enticing. It was perfect. It was great.
There are many, many photographs in this book. One of the things you note from the photographs, you say she has this perfect face, and obviously she does, but she's also very changeable looking.
Considering how beautiful she was and how her beauty was what caught the imagination of so many people, she really wasn't very vain. Lubitsch, probably her best director for Ninotchka, says that she was the only movie star he ever worked with who never bothered looking in the mirror. She just did it.
And yet there's that scene that you have later in the book where someone walks in and she's in, I think, her dressing room. She's just staring at herself in the mirror, and she's only like 43 or 44.
Oh, she's not that old. She's about 35.
And what happens there?
Well, nobody has ever really known what happened. Her Ninotchka was a huge, huge success. Then MGM didn't know what to do, and the war was coming. We were deep in the Depression. They put her in a movie that wasn't a comedy, but was a farce called Two-Faced Woman. It isn't as terrible as everyone said it was, but it was not a great success. She didn't particularly like it. Still, she was still very valid. However, her European market had vanished because of the war, and the world was changing. She had been through the 30s a serious event. Her movies were important. Suddenly it's all Carmen Miranda and Betty Grable. And she didn't fit into that world, and she probably sensed that. She didn't make the decision to stop making movies. She just didn't do any more. And scores, maybe hundreds of things were proposed to her over the next 20, 30 years. And she thought about them, and she almost made this one, and she could have made that one. It just didn't happen.
You obviously had a lot of fun with the photo captions, and I'm wondering if it was this movie, this last one that you did this with, you had a still from a film. The caption says, no doubt asking herself what she was supposed to be doing in this bizarre movie. Was that final movie, and what was the story there?
Well, the final movie, which is called Two-Faced Woman, is a farce. And farce was not what she could do. She could do comedy. She could do rhapsodic. She could do charming. She could do youthful. But she was not a farcical actress, and it was a terrible match of star to story. And then it all happened, that movie was released the week before Pearl Harbor. So everything changed overnight in American movie making, and she just went along with it. She went along with a lot in her life. She was known for being intransigent and having it her own way. But on the other hand, she was always protected and led first by this director Stiller, later by MGM, her great friends. Everyone worked with her to make her possible, to give her what she wanted. She took full advantage of that. She had full control over her vehicles, over her co-stars, over her directors, over everything. And yet she was passive, and passive in life as well. She drifted, and then she drifted out of the movies. And once in a while, she almost drifted back into them. And then it was over, and she spent the next 45 years doing nothing.
One of the things about this book, I want to talk about the book itself, is it's a really glorious, beautiful object. It weighs a ton. The paper quality, the production, the photos. And anyone who's read your memoir, avid reader, and knows about your history at Simon & Schuster and Knopf, knows how deeply interested you are in a book's packaging. How involved were you with the package of this book, and what was it that you wanted from the physical book itself?
I was totally involved, partly because I am experienced in, but also because my very good publisher, FSG, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, it's not the kind of book they were really used to. Their list is probably weighted far more toward important fiction and serious nonfiction. I don't think they'd ever done a book this elaborate physically. And I have, as you say, a lot of experience in that. And I had a wonderful designer there, Abby Kagan, and the two of us had the world's greatest time laying it out page by page, caption by caption, photo by photo. So it was a labor of love on our part, and FSG just let it happen and applauded from the sidelines.
So for listeners who have never seen a Garbo film and have listened to you speak about her, I'm sure now very curious to watch one. Where would you suggest they start? And do you have a favorite of her films?
Well, if they want pure pleasure, the two movies they should watch are her version of Camille, which we know best today, probably through Verdi's opera La Traviata. It's a brilliant, brilliant piece of work. And her great comedy, Ninotchka, Lubitsch's Ninotchka, in which she plays a very serious, rather dour Soviet commissar, comes to Paris and finds love and is transported and transfigured by it. It's one of the most charming movies ever made, and a huge, huge hit, announced by the famous phrase, Garbo laughs, which was the follow-up to her first sound film, Garbo Talks.
Give me a whiskey. Ginger ale on the side. And don't be stingy, baby.
Well, shall I serve it in a pail?
All that suits me down to the ground.
There is no natural transition to our next subject, which is Sinclair Lewis. You just wrote a really wonderful essay about Lewis on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Babbitt for the book review. But here's the one transition I could find, which is that I was recently reading Death Be Not Proud by John Gunther, whose Inside USA you last wrote about for the book review. And I noticed that there was a photo of John Gunther and his wife in Garbo, that they were friends of Garbo. And in the biographical notes in Death Be Not Proud, it noted that not only was Garbo part of a circle, but also Sinclair Lewis. So I'm assuming you knew that they all sort of crossed paths.
Well, I don't know that Garbo and Sinclair Lewis crossed paths. That I can't say, and nobody does say. But her closest friend in her later years in New York was Jane Gunther, who was John Gunther's second wife, and a totally, apparently wonderful person who lived to be 99 or 100 and spoke about her wonderfully. Sinclair Lewis was in and out of New York far more than Garbo. Garbo lived in New York for 45 years. She was not really American, although she became a citizen. She spent a lot of time abroad, but their paths didn't cross so far as I know.
Well, I guess then the one connecting the tissue is John Gunther somehow in between them.
They are closest in this, to my mind, in the sense that both of them hit the world like a cyclone when they emerged. When Sinclair Lewis wrote Main Street, overnight, probably the most successful novel of the early part of the 20th century in America and abroad. And when Garbo hit, there was that same huge international furor. So they were catapulted into extreme fame. I don't know whether it was good for either of them or not in the long run, but that's what happened.
It's surprising how many of Sinclair Lewis's novels have really endured. I mean, he wrote a tremendous number of books.
22.
The later ones, not especially good. The early ones, also maybe not as good. But when you think about the books that are still read today, Babbitt, Main Street, Arrowsmith, Elmer Gantry, It Can't Happen Here.
Dodsworth,
you say, is his best written and most affecting novels. But that one hasn't quite achieved the same enduring renown as the others.
I don't know that I agree with that, because Dodsworth was fortunate enough to become the subject of the best movie ever made of his work, which was called, indeed, Dodsworth in the mid-1930s, a William Wyler movie, which I recommend to one and all.
I stand corrected then on Dodsworth.
It's the best written of his books. He's not a particularly good or bad writer. His writing doesn't have any strong quality of its own. It isn't lyrical, it isn't powerful, it isn't funny, it isn't charming. It's very capable, it works, it does the job, but you don't think of him for his writing. It was more in those early years for the subjects and for the way he anatomized America. That is what he really did. And those 5 novels, including Elmer Gantry, were the books that did it. But he was the most successful novel, other than maybe genre writers, of the first half of the 20th century in America.
You describe that anatomizing of American life as this kind of all-consuming attention to the surfaces of American life. How so?
He looked, he listened, he noted, he obsessed on what he was seeing. Wherever he went, he took endless notes. He inventoried America. That's what I ended up concluding. He wanted to catch America, describe it, put it on paper. As I say, he didn't have a style. He had an all-observing eye and ear, and he just took note in every possible way and laid it out for us. When you read him, when you read all these books, you feel, yes, this is what America was like in this period. Now we know. Is it inspiring? Not necessarily.
You mentioned the success of Sinclair Lewis, and again, people might not remember all of this today, but he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, the first American to do so. Explain what happened with the Pulitzer Prizes, because it's complicated.
Well, he was the center of a scandal, really, when Main Street, which had been hailed as the major book of its moment and of its time, was chosen by the Pulitzer Prize judges to win the award for its year, which was 1920. And then the trustees of the Pulitzer Prize rejected it and instead gave the award to Edith Wharton. That did not sit well with Sinclair Lewis, oddly enough. So when some years later they awarded it to him for, I believe it was Arrowsmith, he turned it down. He was thin-skinned. And that happened again many years later with Gravity's Rainbow, when Pynchon's book was also chosen by the Pulitzer judges and rejected by the trustees. Did not speak well for the Pulitzer Prize.
Together, we're going to leave listeners with a huge list of books to read, beginning with your latest book, Garbo. And then they can go on to read Main Street and Babbitt and Dodsworth and Arrowsmith. And then also, and we've talked about this on an earlier episode of the podcast, your memoir, Avid Reader, and your most recent collection of essays, near-death experiences, and others. And I'm just going to throw in one other book by you that I especially love, which was Great Expectations, The Sons and Daughters of Charles Dickens.
Thank you, Pamela, because the Dickens book happens to be my favorite among my books. Not that I sit around rating them or thinking about them.
Why is that one your favorite?
No one had done that before. Dickens was, of course, the most famous writer of the 19th century and remains one of the most famous writers in the world. He was a family man. He invented, quote unquote, Christmas as we know it, and he had 10 children. But what were they? What happened to them? What was his relation to them? It really fascinated me, and I was very happy to be able to lay it all out.
I second the recommendation. That book, again, is Great Expectations, The Sons and Daughters of Charles Dickens. Bob, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Carl Bernstein joins us now, the author of many books. He joins us from Sag Harbor to talk about his latest. It's called Chasing History, A Kid in the Newsroom. Carl, thanks so much for being here.
Good to be with you.
This book is about your early years as a journalist. Why did you want to cover this period in particular? Because it's very tightly focused in terms of the years.
It's 1960 to 1965, which are the years that I was at the Washington Star, the Evening Star, the afternoon paper in Washington, D.C., the opposition paper to the Washington Post, and probably a better paper at the time than the Washington Post. And they were joyous, amazing years in which I learned my trade. I became a reporter at 19. I went there when I was 16 and in danger of not being able to graduate from high school and occasional scrapes with the juvenile court and not knowing where I was going in my life. But it's also very much a book about the past. It's really about the present because it is about reporting and these astonishing people that I worked with who became like my family.
I mean, you were only 16 when you started in journalism. That is quite young. As you said, you hadn't graduated from high school. What was going on in your life then that brought you to a newsroom?
I was spending a lot of time at the pool hall. I was getting terrible grades in school. I was working Saturdays at a low-rent department store in a bad part of town selling merchandise on layaway to people in a poor neighborhood. What happened was that my father was a union organizer, and the Star had covered a strike by his union, the Government Workers Union, really with amazing accuracy and fairness, unlike the Washington Post. He called the government columnist of the Star, who got me an interview with one of the owners of the paper, who was actually the production manager of the paper. And he thought I was too short, too young to be hired, but he had me take a typing test. And I had taken typing with the girls in high school, and I seemed to have a kind of astonishing facility for it because I could type about 90 words a minute. I took this test at the Star, a typing test, and I kept knocking on the production editor's door. I would come down there and sit in the lobby and say, "Hey, I'm here again." And I think he was kind of irritated by it probably. But then he saw the typing test and he called me up and he said, "Boy, how'd you learn to type like that?" And I did not tell him it was with the girls in the typing class. And he said, "Come on in to see me." And I got hired that day at $29 a week as a copy boy. He also took me down the center aisle of the newsroom, and there were reporters typing and click, clack, click, and people acting as if they were in the most important errands in the nation and shouting copy. I'd never seen anything like it. It was the most exciting thing I had ever seen. And it was at that moment I knew what I wanted to do with my life, be a newspaper man.
Let's stop at that title that you were given, that you were hired as a copy boy, because so many of the titles in your book, these jobs, they don't exist anymore. Copy boy, dictation, city desk clerk, church editor. Let's just go through them. I mean, what was a copy boy and what did you do on the job as a copy boy?
The copy boy did everything. He was almost a link between the editorial functions of the newspaper, the repertorial functions that were done by the reporters, and the composing room, which was the mechanical part of the operation in which the type was actually set. But reporters would yell copy like that, and a copy boy would run to the reporter. Remember, this is an afternoon paper. People are typing and writing on deadline, and he'd yell copy, and a copy boy would literally run to the reporter. The reporter would take out of his typewriter, rip out of his typewriter a couple paragraphs that he was writing and typing. The copy boy would then run it to the literally run it to the appropriate desk, city, state, national, foreign, and then go back to his perch where he was sitting, wherever it was, waiting for the next cry of copy. The copy boy would also, certainly for the city editor, Sid Epstein, who was really my mentor, great mentor at the paper, and a lot of the book deals with Sid Epstein, and who gave me these amazing opportunities. I would fetch his breakfast. He wouldn't yell copy. He called me kid. And I would go upstairs and get his same breakfast every day of grits and a toasted bagel. But copy boys did everything, and the place couldn't function without copy boys. The other thing we did is we made up books, we called them 6-ply books of newsprint with double-sided carbon paper inside, almost like a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, except it was made with carbon paper. And these are the books on which the reporters typed their stories. And remember, we're talking about mechanical, old-fashioned typewriters, not electric typewriters, not computers, so that the whole sound of the newsroom was click, clack, click, 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 clack, 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 a kind of leitmotif, almost like in classical music, like a basso continuo.
You really get a sense of how physical it was. I mean, earlier you said that the guy's response was you were too young and too short, which wouldn't seem to make sense, but you're running around this newsroom.
You're running around, and I was still 5'3" and growing. I had just finished the 11th grade. I was a good deal younger than the other copy boys. They were 19, 20, about that age.
So it was pretty atypical for someone your age with your background to start in a newsroom the way you did.
Yes. But the one thing about it that figures through the whole book and through, I guess, my whole life was that I got the job because I was persistent. I kept knocking on the door, literally, of this production editor until he finally succumbed. And the other thing about the book is that my 5 years at the Star bracketed the Civil War by 100 years, literally. So the book is also very much about what's going on in the country at the time, especially civil rights, the Kennedy presidency and administration. That same year, at age 16, I started going to Kennedy's press conferences to dictate a text of the press conference back to the newsroom. And I got to go to not almost all, but probably almost all of Kennedy's press conferences, or a good number of them.
Since we're talking about the politics of the moment, talk a little bit about the Washington City Star's politics. It was the more conservative of DC's two major newspapers at the time, right? The Post was the more liberal paper. How did that, or did it, affect the coverage and sort of the atmosphere at the paper during that period?
Well, it's interesting because my parents were left-wing people, and my father preferred the Washington Star because it had covered his union and that strike that I mentioned with great fairness, unlike the Washington Post, which had red-baited the union and in covering the strike seemed to be more interested or thinking that somehow Moscow had something to do. Remember, we're at the height of the Cold War, the height of the McCarthy period still. Even in 1960, McCarthyism persisted. And my father thought that the Star, and he was right, that the Star was a much fairer newspaper that had no ideology driving its reporting, whereas the Post did. It was a liberal newspaper, and that point of view bled into its reporting. And we at the Star, really had a view of the Post at the time until Ben Bradley became the editor of the Washington Post and until Katharine Graham became the publisher, that the Post really had an ideology in its coverage, especially its local coverage. And one of the things that we prided ourselves on at the Star was that what we were really doing was the phrase that Bob Woodward and I came to use in the coverage of Watergate, which was the best obtainable version of the truth. And a phrase similar to that was literally said in the newsroom to each other, that we were looking for really all of the truth that was contextual, that was accurate in its facts, that was fair minded, but above all, it was the best obtainable version of the truth. And the Washington Post often fell short of that standard until Bradley got to the paper.
So you mentioned when you got to the newsroom, just seeing the energy that first day, you knew that that's where you wanted to be. What motivated you at that time on the job to do your work, to get ahead as a journalist? And did that change over time, that sort of core motivation?
Watching these great, amazing reporters like Mary Lou Warner, who had just won a Pulitzer Prize for covering massive resistance to integration in Virginia, Haynes Johnson, Mary McGrory, David Broder, the greatest reporters of their time. Many of them were in this newsroom. And I saw what they were doing and I studied what they were doing. And I knew that's what I wanted to do, including some of what we would call investigative reporting at the time, and we still call investigative reporting. But the other thing was, it was about the country. It was about the capital of the United States. I'm a native, a second generation native of Washington, D.C., and I loved the city. And I knew the city, and I learned more and more about the city every day. My first reporting assignment, I had been there about a month at the Star, and copy boys and the dictationists who took these stories and typed them out with a headset on, copy boys and dictationists were sent out at night, earning $7.50 extra on top of their pay to cover citizens and civic association meetings in Washington, D.C. And the distinction, incidentally, 100 years after the Civil War, between a civic association in a neighborhood and a citizens association was that the citizens association were white residents of the neighborhood and a civic association was for African Americans. I grew up in a Jim Crow town. Washington was a Jim Crow town when I grew up in it. I went to legally segregated public schools in the capital of the United States until Brown versus Board of Education when I was in the 6th grade. And my parents had taken me with them in the early 50s to sit in at the segregated lunch counters downtown in Washington, D.C. Black people in Washington, D.C., the only place they could eat in the 1950s, up until the 50s, were government cafeterias and one cafeteria chain called Shoals Cafeterias, which was owned by a rather forward-thinking man. It was a segregated town. When I was in grammar school, all of the swimming pools in Washington were drained by the recreation board of the city so they would not be integrated. People in this country have no idea today of what Washington was like as a segregated town, the nation's capital.
Well, I was going to bring up the fact that maybe people have no idea what Washington is like at all, just given the changing nature of local news coverage. It sounds like the city itself of Washington, D.C., not just the politics and the sort of the town industry of the government, but the city itself was covered very thoroughly by the Washington City Star. What's happened to local reporting of Washington since then? I mean, how different was it back then in terms of the extent of the coverage?
You've hit on part of the reason for the book and what it really is. Because, yes, it's a memoir about the past. And incidentally, the book is written in almost the voice and point of view of this kid from age 16 to 21. It's not the old man looking back. It's really written from the point of view of this kid telling this amazing story of him having the greatest seat in the nation from age 16 to 21 and what happened then and what it was like. So it's a book that's really, as you're indicating, about the past, but it's really in many ways about the present and what resonates today, including 100 and whatever, however many years it is now since the Civil War. And we still are looking as perhaps one of the most important questions in our country is what is happening to the descendants of slaves in America today? So there's a resonance in the book that comes through an authoritarianism during the McCarthy period, during the tyrannical reign of J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, trying to root out communists, trying to, in fact, suppress Martin Luther King and his movement because Hoover wanted to somehow show that King was really a communist, which was absurd. So to get the context of the book and the city, you have to look at it in terms of its segregation and in terms of this time that I was at the Star is the height of the Cold War. And those two things, the pall of the Civil War cast over our daily lives, as did the Cold War in the capital of the United States.
What did you want to emphasize most for readers of a younger generation about this earlier era in journalism? Like, was there a record in particular about the landscape that you wanted to preserve?
Absolutely. But again, it resonates today because this is a book about reporting. This is about basic reporting. And in fact, there are a number of quotes on the jacket of the book from Bob Woodward, from Doris Kearns Goodwin, from John Meacham, from Eugene Robinson, about how this is a book about reporting and really the origins in some ways of investigative reporting, how reporting is really done. And in fact, it's almost, hey, America, this is how reporting was done, how it leads to our coverage in Watergate, Bob Woodward and myself, because it's a roadmap of how you do reporting. It's not about looking things up on the internet. It's what we need to be doing now, which is to be knocking on doors, getting out into the communities we cover. Really, persistence, engagement, perpetual engagement with the story, not taking no for answers, not going to easy places like people in their offices where there are other people around and they're liable to tell you a tale that isn't true, but to knock on their doors at night as we did in Watergate.
One thing this book is not about, it's not about Nora Ephron, which is that perhaps the elephant in the room. When word circulated that you had a memoir coming out, a lot of people said, oh, this is going to be his response to her version of the account of your marriage with her, which was novelized in her book Heartburn and then in the movie. Obviously, that's not what this book is. But do you ever plan to write about that?
If I ever were to write a memoir about my whole life, of course I would write about it because that would have to do with the best obtainable version of the truth. It's a real part of my life. Am I ever going to write another memoir that is about my whole life? And look, I've had a big life. It's been an astonishing life. It's been a wonderful life. And part of the wonder of it is my children, our children, Nora's and my children. So sure, I would write about that if I did another memoir. It's possible I might. It's a part of my life that's important.
I have one last question. This is also about something that's not in the book, but I have to ask you at least one Watergate question. And you started to allude to this, that when you talked about the way in which people need to report as opposed to the way they do. Given the newsrooms of today, given the pressures, given the internet, all of the changes you talked about, how do you think a story like Watergate would be reported and edited now? Would the process have been similar to what you and Bob Woodward went through at the time?
If in a newsroom today, as there are, I believe, a reporter or a couple of reporters went out at night and knocked on the doors, first of all, the reporting on the Trump presidency is maybe some of the greatest reporting on the White House that we have ever seen. And not just by one news organization, the way the Washington Post was way in front of the story during Watergate, by 8 or 9 news organizations. But really, in terms of what Watergate was and how it would be covered today, it would require exactly the same techniques that I learned at the Washington Star and that Bob Woodward and I used at the Washington Post, which was persistence, common sense, knock on doors at night, not in the daytime when people are in their offices and they're under pressure. Just try to get to them at night. Work overtime. Keep pressing and taking. Don't take no for an answer. Go to the next door and knock on it. Good reporting is an investigative reporting. It's not just about a string of facts. It's about context. It's about fairness. It's about accuracy. It's about detail. It is rigorous. And is that kind of reporting the norm in most newsrooms? No, it is not. It's the exception. And in fact, the internet in particular has undermined the concept of the kind of reporting that we did. It is very much the exception in newsrooms today. Doesn't happen enough. And that's one of the things about this book is it's a roadmap. It's a roadmap about how you go about the kind of reporting that we did in Watergate, that Bob Woodward still does today at the Washington Post and in his books. That's what this book is, about America, about journalism, about a time in the history of the nation. And I hope people really enjoy it because it's also meant to be a read about this kid who, as I say, gets the best seat in the country from ages 16 to 21.
All right. Well, this is the book where everything got started. It is called, again, Chasing History, A Kid in the Newsroom by Carl Bernstein. Carl, thank you so much again for being here.
It's fun to do.
Liz Harris joins us now to tell us about what's going on in the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. So today we're going to talk about book sales. 2020 was a big surprise for the publishing industry because sales were actually really good. Everyone was stuck at home, schools were closed, people bought a lot of books, a lot of workbooks for their kids, a lot of books themselves. So book sales last year were up almost 10% over the year before. And this year, 2021, most people expected that at least some of that was going to fall off as people kind of went back out into the world, went back to school, you could go to the movies, people were kind of out living their lives more. The year is now over, and we now can say for sure that book sales actually rose again. According to the Association of American Publishers, consumer book sales increased another 13% in 2021 over the year before. I talked to NPD BookScan about this, which is a group that tracks this sort of thing. And one thing that's really interesting about this wasn't a year that was driven by like monster sales of one book like Harry Potter. It was actually really spread around. So only 2 books and maybe 3, once everything's all counted, are expected to hit 1 million print copies sold. Those are a new Dog Man book, a Diary of a Wimpy Kid book, and American Marxism by Mark Levin.
All appearing together on the same shelf
Exactly.
at your nearest independent bookseller.
Lots of overlap.
All right. Well, thank you for good news to start off the new year.
Thank you, Pamela.
Our critics join us now to talk about what they've been reading and reviewing. We've got Molly Young and Jennifer Salai. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Molly, let's start with you. What did you write about most recently?
I wrote about the popular resurgence of the ancient philosophy known as Stoicism.
And was this based around any new books on the subject, or what brought you to this topic?
So what brought me to it was a book called Breakfast with Seneca by David Fideler, who's a philosopher. And from there, I kind of ping-ponged back and forth between the ancient texts that he refers to and then some of the more popular contemporary contributions. So, for example, Ryan Holiday, who's the big breakthrough book in 2014, he wrote The Obstacle is the Way, and then subsequently wrote The Daily Stoic, and he's written a bunch of books about the philosophy. And then I read an excellent book by Massimo Pigliucci, who also has formal training in philosophy and comes at the topic from a very skeptical, science-based point of view. So I went back and forth between old and new books.
And why Stoicism now?
Well, it's become very popular in the wake of the pandemic over the past 2 years, I guess. And it is appealing, I think, for a couple of reasons. It really offers people a method of getting through chaos with some level of equanimity. So that's a point in its favor. And then, it offers a kind of set of both behavioral prescriptions and a dimension that you could call spiritual or metaphysical. Humans throughout history have gravitated towards such systems of meaning, and it's often in the form of a religious practice. But for people who maybe don't have a religious practice, a philosophy like Stoicism can be very appealing.
And what is Stoicism?
It's complicated. One of the things that can be tricky with these books is that they often present it as a kind of life hack. And as with anything that really does work, it's challenging and demanding and requires a lot of reading and thinking and practice. But the sort of number one tenet of Stoicism is that there are things you can control and things you can't control. And you really shouldn't be too concerned about things in the second category, because that only leads to anxiety and depression and distraction, other bad feelings. So that sounds really great. But the problem then is distinguishing between what you can and can't control, which turns out to be more of a kind of misty spectrum than a dichotomy. And that's what a lot of the Stoic writing is about.
I'm wiped out. Jen, do you have any questions that you want to interject here?
Actually, I do have a question. Molly, because you looked at books by both people who treat it as a life hack as well as people who actually have training. Did you see that the people who treated it as a life hack, did they distort the philosophy in any way? Or were they using it in a way that you found useful?
I think an uncharitable reading would be to say that they distorted it, and a charitable reading would be to say that they maybe offered a little bit of sugar to help the medicine go down. Mm-hmm. If you tell people that something is very difficult and challenging, they won't do it. Right. But if you tell them that it's a life hack, they might dip a toe in, and then having dipped a toe, they might be invested in engaging in the kind of mindfulness practices and the thought experiments that Stoicism requires. And I should say that it promises a great deal. Stoicism promises to teach you how to live a good life and be a happy person and engaged with the world and your community, but it also requires a ton of work.
Right.
Jen, what did you write about? It was not Stoicism.
It was definitely not Stoicism. I reviewed a book recently called How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them by a political scientist named Barbara Walter. As the title suggests, that's sort of the broad subject, but she started this book in 2018, she says in her acknowledgments. And what it's also about is about the possibility of another civil war in the United States. And so she looks at the subject from a comparative perspective. She looks at other countries. She looks at how conflict and civil war started in places like the former Yugoslavia, the Philippines, Iraq. And so she lays out this case basically saying that the U.S. is in what she calls the danger zone of political collapse. And she herself, as a scholar who has spent her career studying this stuff, she doesn't come across in the first half of the book as necessarily alarmist, but what she's basically pointing to is something really troubling. So she uses the tools of a political scientist as well as her scholarly background in order to just make a very straightforward case that there are a number of things that we have to address if we want to stop something very terrible from happening.
Is something terrible, very terrible going to happen?
Well, she doesn't make a definite forecast, but she does say that there are really troubling signs. So, for instance, when it comes to democracy, she's saying that we're living in a situation of decaying democracy, that some of the guardrails that used to be in place have been corroded, especially within the last several years. And the rise of factionalism, that there is a group of people who used to enjoy what would be called a dominant status and now feel that their status is slipping away, that can make for a politically incendiary moment. And we also live in a country where a lot of people have guns. And she says that having an armed population makes things very precarious and can turn conflict into something very violent very quickly. That's the conclusion. So I feel like when I lay it all out, it does sound alarmist. But she really goes through the research. And I mentioned in the review that she uses a lot of things like measurements and scales to show the different stages of, for example, when a country moves between democracy and autocracy, and that there's a very dangerous middle zone called anocracy. And so she's basically saying that the U.S. is in this danger zone, and this has happened relatively quickly. It's happened within the last 5 years. And she's saying that there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on all levels. And her book goes some ways toward the end, towards showing what needs to be done. I think the issue that I took with it toward the end is just the situation she lays out is so complicated that it's hard to sort of imagine things being resolved with the pointers that she offers toward the end.
Maybe Stoicism will help. Maybe it'll help us all.
There you go.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.